For most of the last 2 centuries, the official verdict on the way Gullah people spoke was that it was broken English, corrupted, a failure to learn the real thing properly. That verdict was wrong, and the man who proved it was wrong had to fight for years to be taken seriously. His name was Lorenzo Dow Turner. He was the first professionally trained African-American linguist in the country, and in the 1930s, he went down to the Sea Islands with a recording machine and wrote down what he actually heard instead of what he had been told was there. He found close to 4,000 items of African origin, words used in ordinary conversation, grammar that follows rules English does not have, and hundreds of personal names people had carried for generations without knowing they meant something in a language spoken 4,000 miles away. Names that mean child and axe and large tree, carried across an ocean and down through 6 or 7 generations by families who had been told their speech was a mistake. It was not broken anything, it was its own language, intact, with a homeland. The problem was that nobody could say where. When Turner finally published in 1949, the field accepted his argument almost immediately. Gullah drew directly on West African languages. That part was settled. But which ones, and from where, was not. Turner traced influence from something like 40 separate African languages. Roughly a dozen of them came from one comparatively small area, the region around the Mano River in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Nobody could explain that. Nothing about a random slave trade produces a concentration like that. The pieces did not fit together. The answer was in 3 places nobody thought to look at the same time. A shipping ledger, a funeral song, and one stretch of coastline where the rice grows in salt water. My name is Felicia. I have spent 32 years pulling records for other people's families, and most of that time I have been working around a wall, 1870, where the paper stops. The Gullah Geechee are the great exception to that wall. Not because their history was gentler, because of something specific that happened to them, for reasons that had nothing to do with anybody's mercy. So I am going to walk you through all 3 of those places. The ledger first, because it explains everything after it. Then the coastline. Then the song, which took 200 years and a very stubborn anthropologist to finish. And near the end, I will tell you the one thing your DNA results still cannot do for you, no matter what the company selling them implies. That one comes at the end. If you are getting something out of this, subscribe. It tells me these are worth the research. Let me start with what most people are told, because it is not wrong. It is just not enough. The standard explanation goes like this. The Sea Islands were hard to reach. Malaria was everywhere. White planters and overseers left during the sick season and stayed away as much as they could. Left largely alone, enslaved Africans held on to what they carried. Isolation preserved the culture. That is real. Every part of it is documented. But look at what it fails to account for. Isolation explains preservation. It does not explain specificity. Take that apart for a second, because this is the hinge of the whole subject. Plenty of communities in American history were isolated. Mountain communities in Appalachia, fishing villages in New England. Give any of them 2 or 3 generations and their old world connections thin out into folklore. That is what isolation normally does. It preserves a blur. What survived on the Sea Islands was not a blur. The spiritual practices do not show generic West African influence. They show identifiable structural elements. The rice growing does not show general farming knowledge. It shows tidal cultivation techniques specific to one narrow agricultural zone. And the grammar of the Gullah language lines up with Sierra Leonean Creole in patterns that no linguist explains by coincidence. That is not cultural memory in the loose sense. That is cultural memory with an address. Isolation cannot produce that. Isolation only protects what is already there. Something had to put a coherent, unmixed population on those islands in the first place. And that something was rice. Here is the part that turns the whole story cold. In the early 1700s, planters in South Carolina wanted to grow rice in coastal marshland. They did not know how. Tidal rice cultivation is genuinely difficult. You have to read flooding cycles. You have to build and manage banks and floodgates. You have to know what the soil does under saltwater intrusion. Nobody in England knew any of this. Nobody in the colonies knew it either. But people along a stretch of West Africa had been doing it for centuries. They grew their own domesticated species, Oryza glaberrima, African rice, in exactly these conditions. That coastline runs from Senegal and Gambia in the north, down through Guinea and Sierra Leone toward Liberia. The traders called it the Rice Coast. So Charleston planters began asking for people from there specifically, not generally African, from the Rice Coast. And they paid premiums to get them. I want to be precise about what that means, because it is the most disturbing detail in this entire history, and it changes how you should read your own results. These were not people taken at random and put to work. They were selected for expertise they already had. The knowledge in their heads is what made them valuable. It is the reason they were targeted. If your ancestors came through this trade, you are not descended from people who were chosen for their bodies. You are descended from people who were chosen for what they knew. There is a place where you can see this happen on paper. In the Sierra Leone River, about 20 miles upstream from where Freetown sits today, there is an island with the ruins of a British slave castle on it. Bunce Island. The stonework is still standing. Bunce specialized. It supplied the rice colonies, and its records survive. Its principal owner was a Scottish merchant named Richard Oswald. His business agent in Charleston was a rice planter and slave dealer named Henry Lawrence. Lawrence received the ships, advertised the people aboard them, ran the auctions, and took a 10% commission on each sale. He sent the profits back to Oswald in London, often paid in Carolina rice. Now hold on to both names, because of what happened to them next. Henry Lawrence became president of the Continental Congress. He was captured at sea by the British and held in the Tower of London. Richard Oswald posted his bail. And when the war ended, those two men sat across a table from each other in Paris, negotiating the treaty that recognized the United States as a country. Oswald for the British, Lawrence for the Americans. American independence was negotiated, in part, between the owner of a slave castle and the man who sold its captives in Charleston. That is not an interpretation. It is in the diplomatic record. UNESCO has described Bunce Island as the one place in the entire trade where Africans were targeted specifically because of their skills, not their labor, their expertise. So now put the two halves together. By buying deliberately from one narrow region, over and over, for decades, Charleston planters did something they never intended. They assembled a population that was not scrambled. Everywhere else in the American South, the practice was to mix ethnic groups on purpose, so that people could not organize and could not talk to each other. On the Sea Islands, the economic incentive ran the other way. The planters wanted Rice Coast people, so they got Rice Coast people, concentrated together, sharing overlapping languages and compatible spiritual frameworks. They built a community when they were trying to build a workforce. And then they left. Malaria kept them away for months at a time, and the rice work was organized by task rather than by gang, which meant supervision ran through black drivers who were themselves part of the community. Gullah people ran those operations. They directed the work. They trained new arrivals, which means cultural transmission was not something they had to hide. It was built into the job. Here is the sentence I would underline if this were on paper. The culture did not survive in spite of slavery on the Sea Islands. It survived because that particular slave economy could not function without it. Their captors needed them to keep knowing what they knew. Now, the genetics. Starting in the late 2000s and through the 2010s, researchers began analyzing ancestry in Gullah Geechee communities with better resolution than earlier work allowed. They expected roughly what you would see in any African American population, predominantly West and Central African ancestry, some European admixture from the plantation period, possibly a small indigenous American component. Some of that held, some of it did not. Two findings stood out. The first was concentration. Gullah Geechee samples showed elevated frequencies of maternal and paternal lineages that today cluster in specific regions of Sierra Leone and the Senegambia, statistically distinguishable from African American populations in the interior South. The second finding is the one that matters more, and it gets less attention. The clustering was unusually tight. In plain terms, many Gullah Geechee individuals share ancestors not just at the level of a broad region, but at the level of particular communities within West Africa. The scattering you would expect from the general trade, where dozens of ethnic groups were deliberately mixed, is compressed here. The DNA is showing you the purchasing pattern. 250 years of deliberate selection, and you can still see it in your own saliva sample. I do want to be straight with you about one thing, because this channel is not going to overstate a study to make a better video. Some retellings of this research cite it more confidently than the underlying work supports, and at least one popular version names a study and an organization that do not go together. The concentration finding is real, and it is held up. The precision claims, the ones that suggest DNA can point at a specific village, go further than the published research does. Which brings me to something I need to address directly, because it comes up every single time this subject does. There is a claim circulating that the Gullah Geechee are not of African descent at all, that they were here 1,000 years before slavery, that they are indigenous to the Americas, and that the migration story is a fabrication. I want to handle that with respect, because underneath it is a real and legitimate grief. When a system spends 4 centuries erasing your origins and lying about your history, refusing the official version is not irrational. It is earned. But here is where I land, and I will show you my reasoning rather than just asserting it. The evidence for the West African connection is not one government document that could be forged. It is 4 independent lines that were never coordinated. Shipping manifests kept by the traders themselves for their own profit, with no reason to invent anything. Linguistic analysis done in the 1930s, before anyone had a political stake in the outcome. Agricultural technique that matches a specific West African practice in specific detail. And genetic data collected decades later by people who had never read the manifests. 4 separate methods, run by different people at different times, all landing in the same narrow place. That is what makes a finding solid. Not any one of them. The agreement between them. And there is something else worth saying. Indigenous American ancestry in Gullah Geechee families is real, documented, and important. Coastal Carolina and Georgia had native nations, and there was intermarriage and shared refuge. Those are not competing histories. Both are in the record and both belong to the same families. The Sierra Leone connection does not take anything from anybody. Watch what it gave 3 families. 1933. A linguist named Lorenzo Dow Turner is working along the Georgia coast, documenting the Gullah language. In a fishing community called Harris Neck, he records a woman named Amelia Dawley singing a 5-line song. She does not know what it means. She learned it from her mother, who learned it from hers. Nobody in Harris Neck knows what language it is in. It has just always been sung. Turner records it, and then it sits. For more than 50 years. In 1989, an anthropologist named Joseph Opala comes across the recording in an archive. He is a specialist in the Sierra Leone trade, and he can hear that the song is in Mende. So he takes it to Sierra Leone. Him, an ethnomusicologist named Cynthia Schmidt, and a Sierra Leonean linguist named Tazief Karoma. And they play a recording of a Georgia woman's voice in one Mende village after another. Over and over, people tell them the same thing. We recognize the language. We do not know the song. Village after village. For a long time. Then they reach a place called Gullah, in the far south, outside the area they had thought worth searching. Schmidt plays the recording, and a woman named Bayandu Jabati begins to sing along. She knows all of it. It is a funeral song, performed by women preparing a body for burial, and in her family it passes from grandmother to granddaughter. Her own grandmother taught it to her, along with something else. She told her that one day this song would bring back relatives who had been lost, and that this is how she would know them. In 1997, Amelia Dawley's daughter, Mary Moran, then in her 60s, traveled from Harris Neck, Georgia, to Gullah, Sierra Leone. 2 women who had never met stood together at a grave and sang the same song. Their families had been separated for roughly 200 years, and neither line had dropped it. That is the first family. The second went in 1989, before the song was traced. Emery Campbell, who directed Penn Center on St. Helena Island, led a delegation of Gullah people to Sierra Leone and out to the ruins on Bunce Island. They poured libation on the jetty, where captives walked to the boats. The trip was filmed and shown on public television. That was the first time in the modern era that a Gullah community formally went back. The third one is the most specific case anybody has, and it may never be repeated. April 9, 1756. A ship called the Hare leaves the Sierra Leone River carrying 84 people. Among them is a girl of about 10. 16 people die on the 10-week crossing. The Hare docks at Charleston in June. Henry Lawrence handles the sail. A rice planter named Elias Ball buys 6 children, gives them English names, and takes them to Cumming Tea Plantation. The girl is named Priscilla. She lives the rest of her life enslaved on Ball land, marries a man named Jeffrey, has 10 children, and dies in 1811 at about 65. Now, the reason we know any of this. The Ball family kept meticulous records for 200 years. In the 1990s, a descendant of theirs, the writer Edward Ball, went through those records and traced Priscilla's line forward through 7 generations to a living family in Charleston. Then in 2004, Joseph Opala found the shipping records of the Hare itself in a New York archive, which produced something almost no African American family has, an unbroken paper trail from the day a ship left Africa to a person alive right now. In May of 2005, Tomalin Martin Polite, a speech therapist from Charleston and Priscilla's great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter, flew to Sierra Leone. The government had invited her by letter. She stood on the jetty at Bunce Island, where the girl had left. The whole time she was there, people called her Priscilla. 249 years. There is one more branch of this family, and most people have no idea it exists. Bahamians who visit the Carolina coast keep reporting the same experience. They hear somebody talking in a store or on a street, and it sounds like home, like the family islands. Exuma, Long Island, Abaco. So they ask which island the person is from, and get told Charleston. That is not a coincidence, and nobody is imagining it. In 1782, the British evacuated Savannah. In 1783, they evacuated Charleston. Loyalists leaving took enslaved people with them, and thousands were carried to the Bahamas. The Bahamian population tripled, and most of the black people arriving came from exactly the Gullah and Geechee coastal regions of Carolina and Georgia. So those are relatives. One coastal culture, split by a British evacuation, developing separately on 2 sides of the water for 240 years, and still recognizable to each other across a checkout line. If your family is Bahamian or Turks and Caicos, this history is yours too. Same origin, same records, different flag. One more thing before I let this go, because I have seen the complaint, and it is fair. This subject gets told as though it were only South Carolina and Georgia. It is not. The Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, which Congress designated in 2006, runs from Pender County in North Carolina down to St. Johns County in Florida. Wilmington is in it. So is the Georgia coast, the Sea Islands, and the northern Florida coast. And the community reaches far past the corridor now. New York, Philadelphia, Detroit, anywhere the Great Migration went. If your grandmother came north, and you grew up hearing a way of speaking nobody outside the house understood, you are not outside this story. You are in it. Now, the thing I held back. Your DNA results cannot give you a village. They can show you a regional cluster. They can show you living cousins. They cannot walk you to a place on a map and tell you your people stood there. Every one of the 3 families I described got back to a specific place, and not one of them did it with a DNA test. They did it with a song, with plantation records, and with a shipping manifest in an archive. The DNA supports those findings. It did not produce them. And I want to be honest that ethnicity estimates get revised, reference panels improve, groupings get renamed, Percentages shift. Mine have changed twice. That is science working properly, but it is not a foundation to build an identity on. Identity is what your grandmother cooked and what she called it. That is not in a genome and it does not need to be. Here is what I want you to do this week. Write down every phrase in your family that is not standard English. The words for foods, for weather, for kin, ways of saying things that people outside your family never understood. Write them exactly as they are said, not corrected. Then call the oldest person you can reach and ask them one question. Where were we before here? Record the answer if they will let you, and keep the parts you think are wrong. Wrong details still point somewhere. Then search the Freedmen's Bureau records, which are digitized and free, by surname and by county. If your people were coastal, also look for the Penn Center collections and the State Archives in Columbia, which one viewer of this material pointed out is free to use. I found my great-great-grandmother's name in a probate inventory in 2011. My grandmother died in 2003. I was 8 years late, and I am telling you that so you will not be. In the comments, give me the county and the year of the earliest ancestor you can prove on paper. Not the family story, the documented one. Your answer decides which one I make next, because the records behave very differently in Beaufort County than they do in McIntosh County, and I would rather build the next video where you actually are. Next, I am going through Ancestry results region by region, which groupings hold up, which ones get renamed every 18 months, and what to do when yours changes overnight. Your people left you more than a name. Go find the rest.